exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy. Today, last time we gathered, we were finishing Friends pitching fantasy, and we walked away with two wonderful books that we have to read. Promise of Blood, the first book of the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian McClellan, and then we've got Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir coming up after that. But in the meantime, as we are reading these books, Dylan, you, as you sometimes tend to do, you went above and beyond with your extracurricular reading, and we have another book to discuss today. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right. I went above and beyond. Some might even say I ascended, because today we are talking about, in a spoiler-free manner, because you didn't read it, Charles, we are talking about Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft.
Wow. I see from the reviews, one of the best reads I've had in ages, says Mark Lawrence. So I'm really excited to get into this one. I know, Dylan, you had pitched this book two Friends Pitching Fantasies ago. It was not selected. Ended up picking Court of Thorns and Roses instead. Tough competition. But you definitely piqued my interest with this one. This one seemed like it was more of like an out there pick, a more thoughtful, unique individual kind of story. And so and then plus all the praise from Mark Lawrence, of course, combines to I felt like I kind of missed out not picking it. So I'm really curious now that you've actually read it to see, how was your experience? Was it good?
It was good, Charles. I ended up giving it 5 stars on Goodreads.
Wow. That sounds good.
Yeah, out of 5, I would say that's pretty strong. I'm pretty generous with my ratings generally, Charles. I'm not one of those people that's like, dude, that's be the best book I've ever read ever if I'm going to give it 5 stars. Which, if you're one of those people, fine. Do whatever you want. It's your system. But, for me, 5 is like, oh yeah, this is really good. I really enjoyed it. And I would say that Senlin Ascends definitely fits into that category. It is, like you said, a wholly unique story. I can say with confidence I've never read a book quite like it. I would say I can't really think of too many other protagonists quite like the protagonist. It is, it's something that I feel pretty confident I could recommend to a lot of people.
And that's good to hear. I know that what fascinates me most about this story is that I have no idea what to expect. And with stories like these, it just piques my interest. I love the idea of kind of this original story, this original kind of idea for a story. And, you were praising it, and then so many reviewers were saying it's like this great read. It's very imaginative. It's this fantasy sci-fi kind of blend. And, to go back to Mark Lawrence's review, he was like, it's not like my books. It is, however, excellent. So when you hear that over and over again, you're like, what is the secret about this book that I'm not getting from the reviews and from the back of the book? Like, what is the secret sauce with this book?
Well, Charles, you mentioned the back of the book, so let's give that a read to ground people in the story. For sure. And then I'll tell you what you're missing in that back of the book, the secret sauce.
You're hearing it here first, guys.
Or much like one of Coca-Cola's secret ingredient. Isn't that a thing? There's something with the Coke.
They have secret ingredients and secret recipe and this and that, which as a native of Atlanta, that's about as much as we know,
Right. They're not going to let you into any more than that. But let me let you all into the first book of the books of Babel. Babel? Can never seem to get that right. The Tower of Babel, we're going there, is the greatest marvel in the world. Immense as a mountain, the ancient tower holds unnumbered ringdoms, warring and peaceful, stacked on one on the other like the layers of a cake. It is a world of geniuses and tyrants, of airships and steam engines, of unusual animals and mysterious machines. Soon after arriving for his honeymoon at the tower, the mild-mannered headmaster of a small village school, Thomas Senlin, gets separated from his wife, Maria, in the overwhelming swarm of tourists, residents, and miscreants. Senlin is determined to find Maria, but to do so, he'll have to navigate madhouses, ballrooms, and burlesque theaters, Charles. Ooh. He must survive betrayal, assassins, and the long guns of a flying fortress. But if he hopes to find his wife, he will have to do more than just endure. This quiet man of letters must become a man of action. And it actually sets the stage pretty well for what you're getting into, but I guess part of why it sets the stage so well is because it uses a lot of sort of cryptic language, like mysterious machines, unusual animals, like madhouses. It's like all these things that it's like, ooh, like you've piqued my interest, but I'm not quite sure exactly what's going on here. And I think that Senlin Ascends, it's like, in Friends Pitching Fantasy, I said it was giving me the sense that it almost had this like surrealist feel to it, which I would say parts of it does, but maybe not quite as much as I was originally expecting. But I think that it's like there's always this kind of sense that something is amiss. Like when you're reading the book, it's like you don't want to trust anyone that's around you. You feel very much grounded in the protagonist, who I want to get into in a little bit talking about, because I think he's very interesting in his like boringness. Like he's interesting in his mundanity. It's like because like it gets in that back of the book, like he is mild-mannered. He's kind of just like a normal guy in a lot of ways, but he's thrown into this really mystical, scary, at times nightmarish world where like he is like this naive tourist, completely out of his wits. He's trying to go get his wife, and everyone around him is like not what they seem and untrustworthy. And each one of these ringdoms that he goes to, like then the rules change dramatically. And that's one of the strengths of this book, I think, is like, all right, like we're in the basement here, like market, it's this kind of way. And then when you go up to the next ringdom, like everything flips on its head, and whatever you thought you learned in the first one, that's not necessarily going to help you here, beyond the general sense of like, don't trust people and nothing's as it seems. So it's the setting, not only is it interesting and captivating, but it is like changing dramatically multiple times throughout the book, and still presenting really compelling new environment for us to like explore with trepidation.
The setting to me is particularly interesting with this tower with the capital T, the Tower of I'm leaning towards Babel, if I'm being honest. The Tower of Babel, but
that's what I said when we did Kwong's book Babel. I said Babel,
yeah,
but then you hear other people and they'll say Babel, and then you're like,
there's that Bible story, which I am not well read on the Bible, but I always thought that was the
It's
tower.
Pronounced Babel. The Bible's a religious
Is it Bible
text?
Or
yeah.
But I always thought it was the Tower of Babel, but what do I know? And then when someone like
so
speaks
it's Babel in the Bible, or it's Babel in the bio? Is it Babel in the Bible or Babel in the Bible?
It's Babel in the Babel. I don't know. I thought the word like babble, like you're babbling, from that
That's how
story
I
where they
usually
all at
think.
one point spoke the same language, and then I don't know, God got involved, and now they all spoke different languages, and that's that where that word comes from. Was my
Oh.
like that's the story. I don't. And again, that's my
No, I
Spark
think
Notes version.
that sounds right.
So
Yeah.
it's like, oh, now you're just babbling on and on, like I think that's where it comes from.
Mm.
So I'm gonna say babble, but if you say Babel, then one of us is gonna be right, guaranteed. So
Yeah,
we
you say Babel, I say Babel.
that's the beautiful thing
Or
about this beautiful
it's a
country of the
tomato
US of
tomato situation.
A.
I
But
think you're allowed to do that in most countries.
no, America's got freedom of speech.
Right, you're correct. Yeah, we're the only country that you're allowed to alternate how you say the name of this series. Yeah.
But what I was trying to talk about was the setting, because it reminds me, not like in spirit more than anything else, of the Chatham Voyage Quartet with Robert V.S.
Mm.
Reddick. And these kinds of settings always kind of fascinate me, where it's like this contained singular thing, but it's so massive and so expansive that it may as well be an entire like universe, and Chatham Voyage takes place on a ship, and you're like, okay, a ship, but the ship is so vast and large. It's got multiple tiers. It's got mythical creatures living in pipe systems, and then it's got people swinging across the sails, and then it's got the galley, and then it's got all the ship's quarters. It takes on a life of its own, and the setting becomes like a force of nature almost. And it sounds like that's where we're going with the Tower of Babel as well. What do you think, Donna, someone who has read both
Oh,
books?
well, I never made that connection, but I think that you've hit on something really interesting, and I would totally agree. Both with the general idea of this contained thing, but it could be a world unto itself,
Mm-hmm.
and also just how imaginative Senlin Ascends is, and the fact that like you're going through these different ringdoms and they're all so different to each other, but that's kind of similar to Chatham Voyage in some ways, not just with the areas of the ship, but then you might dock somewhere and all of a sudden this is a totally different area with new rules,
Mm-hmm.
and I think both books, one of the first or both series, the Chatham Voyage, they're both quartets, I think, as
No
well. If
kidding.
I believe this is I know Chatham Voyage is a quartet, but I believe the final
Yeah, there's
book
4
in
books. The
Senlin
Fall
Ascends
of
is,
Babel's book 4.
yeah, so both
Ah.
quartets. And you know what else is interesting? Both are absolutely, both authors are absolutely championed by Mark Lawrence. Have you noticed that? Mark
That's
Lawrence,
so
friend of the
fascinating.
show and author of many awesome
Look, my
series.
instincts
And
turned out to be pretty good. If you like quartets with really imaginative settings that have been praised by Mark Lawrence, you have 2 options now. That's pretty good.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, imaginative, definitely one of the first words I
And
would
that
use
was
to
the
describe
thing
both of
about
those.
Robert
And
V.S. Reddick's series 2 was one of my favorite things about it was the amount of original thought and creativity
oh
that
yeah,
fueled that book is unparalleled. I'm like, how did this guy even think this stuff up, let alone write it in an entertaining
I believe
way?
you
You
asked
know,
him that question
I asked it
basically
many
exactly
times. I was like, how?
after every book.
Why? What is going on in your beautiful brain? And I get those vibes from this story as well. It's the way people talk about it, and that's something that I admire quite a bit.
Yeah, and there's a lot to admire with that. There's a reason people will describe it as so unique and different, and I think those certainly fit with the Chatham Voyage Quartet. And
Mm.
I think that it's got an interesting background, this book as well, that maybe we should get into the meta of it. Like the
Mm.
story of this book is that it was originally self-published in, I believe, 2013, and then it was not until many years later that and it Mark Lawrence outlines it pretty.
He discovered
well
it in
here.
SPFBO, right?
Yeah, so it was submitted to SPFBO, I believe, in 2016, and maybe you can fact check me on that, Charles. And it was,
Okay.
yeah, at that point, it had only 50 ratings on Goodreads. And then we're at a point now where it has 28,239 ratings on
Isn't that
Goodreads, to give you a
amazing?
sense. Yeah. And this is the magic that can come from Mark Lawrence's self-published fancy blog off, of which I was a judge, not in this year, but way way back in the distant land of like 2021. And it was, anyway, it was submitted to that. It actually didn't end up making the final, which is pretty shocking, but for it, through being in the competition, and then Mark Lawrence read it, and it picked up a lot of steam both from the competition, Mark Lawrence kind of sending it to some of his folks that he knew in the traditional publishing world, and then it ended up getting picked up, and it is now a traditionally published book, and that all of that has combined to make this a massively successful debut for Josiah
so
Bancroft.
interesting.
It just took a few years after it being published to get to that.
Yeah, you asked me to fact check you, so I found an article from Mark Lawrence's blog, and this was back in December of 2016, and he goes, "Congratulations to Josiah Bancroft as Senlin Ascends reaches 500 Goodread ratings and still doesn't fall below the average rating of 4.5. And then it's like 3 years to reach 50 ratings, 4 more months to reach 500, less than 2 more years to reach 5,000. And in 2021, on the day the fourth and final book was published, Senlin Ascends passes 20,000 Goodreads ratings." So, and that is in itself pretty amazing. So I guess that was around 2016, and maybe he was congratulating him, so maybe it was an earlier SPFBO, but that's just an interesting point, and that's like that to me is just like really a sweet story of like there's so many talented authors, writers, people with ideas writing stuff that we just miss all the time. Like the greatest story we would love is just sitting on a bookshelf somewhere, we have no idea. So when you can make discoveries,
we're not
like
even on a bookshelf, self-published, and has 32 ratings on Goodreads, and you and I will unfortunately never discover it, and it's kind of sad when you think about it that way, but it's also amazing when you think about how many incredible stories are out there just waiting.
Said 3 years to reach 50 ratings. So then 2016, that would have been 2013.
Yeah, I think I got the dates right.
Yeah, it sounds correct.
So it's this magical, it's this mystical world. It's got this magical, mystical background that is hard to imagine and how it ended up becoming so popular. And it's at the center of it all, Charles, is our protagonist, Thomas Senlin, who's described there as the mild-mannered headmaster of a small village school. And I think you hear a lot of these sort of from humble beginnings. I mean, we always like to joke about like Rand in The Wheel of Time, for example, which is a series that massively popular and for good reason, but it's an easy target when it comes to like, oh, I'm just a humble farm boy who's
shepherd,
like jacked and like 6'6", jacked, like red hair and like these deep piercing green eyes, probably. Like,
they were green or blue. It was,
one of those. They ain't brown like my eyes, Charles. We know
yeah,
that
they're more
fact.
like a beautiful greenish blue like mine.
Right, exactly.
And he's more like, over 6 feet like me.
Like you, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, except with that red hair to make him more unique than you, Charles.
Yes, you pointed out my one flaw that will never make me a
Yeah,
fancier.
but you definitely have his build for sure, and no
I
one
can
can
dye
check.
hair, you know. The eyes and the height, those are harder to fake. The hair's
Yeah,
easy.
yeah. And are
Maybe I
you?
should go red.
Yeah, you gonna dye the beard too?
Just shave it.
Yeah. Okay. You might as well.
Worth it to be more like Rand.
And don't we all want to be more like Rand? Because he, despite insisting throughout at least multiple books that I read, that he's a humble shepherd, it's like everyone can clearly see that he's like this badass who's amazing at everything. And the farm boy thing is kind of just a trope to lean on there to pretend that he's coming from these mild, upbringing that's going to lead him to some amazing story. And, is an amazing story. Many, many people feel that way for sure. And how'd I do?
Keep it going. Keep it going.
Yeah, keep it going. All right. And Senlin Ascends, however, like this guy is legit. Thomas Senlin is legit what this person would be like being just some random headmaster from a small village school like he is, suddenly thrust into this world that is so not only different from his own, but harsher and more dangerous and mysterious. And I'll say, Charles, I mean, we always talk about how when we're reading a book, it's like, oh yeah, like this character, like we talked about this with A Court of Thorns and Roses when we read that, yeah, this character does these like wacky things that I would never do, but I guess that's what makes them a good protagonist for a fantasy novel, is they're just charging these situations when I would just be like, I'm just going to sit here and not do that. And it's like, okay, well, I guess that's why I would be a boring fantasy protagonist. But Charles, Thomas Senlin, he's everyman. He's you, Charles. He is you. He's you. And if you were put into the Tower of Babel, I think the way that you would react is probably relatively similar to how Senlin would react, which is either incredible or frustrating or both when you're reading this book. But it's really interesting because it's like, I don't know, he's one of the most realistic protagonists that I've ever read because of that. Like his reactions to things are just so normal in a just completely abnormal setting.
Yet that keeps it interesting still.
Oh, yes. And it's interesting because it's like without the hero complex playing into the like self-insert thing. Like I truly felt like, I'm like, yeah, like I might not want to admit it, but this is probably what I would do. And it's because like, are we all fantasy heroes who are gonna just like naturally take to a situation like this? No, most of us are Charles, and it's
I am for the people. What can I say?
Right.
Of the people.
Yeah, definitely. And so is Thomas Senlin. And it's interesting, though, because as the back of the book implies, it says, this quiet man of letters must become a man of action. And I mean, he is put in a situation where he's looking for his newlywed wife and he's trying to save her, and he's using what sort of skills he has to try to make this happen. And yeah, is he out of his element? Is he in over his head? All of those things for sure. But gosh darn it, Charles, he is trying, and he really gives it a go. And you know what? In a very natural way, that's how he starts to grow and evolve as a character, in the way that someone who just like is forced to by the situation around them. Like if he were to not take on some more courageous characteristics and learn from the things that's happening to him and become a little bit more of that man of action, then that tower would eat him up whole. So he kind of has to, but he takes to it in the way that it really feels like many of us normies out there who aren't Randolph Thor, would take to it. And you don't see that too often. It's like in being such a boring, normal person, especially at the start of the book, Senlin becomes one of the most interesting fantasy protagonists you're going to
Wow.
read because he's confronted with such a complex, unique circumstance that he has to adapt to.
Wow. And that, for an author, can be a really hard thing to pull off. One, to have a genuine, like, everyman protagonist and make him feel genuine. That can be a hard thing to have feel authentic. And then the other piece is like to keep the action moving and to keep it like entertaining as well. And to make those victories and confrontations feel earned. That's not an easy thing to balance at all, So it speaks, that combined with the ambition of the setting and the narrative and all that. It really speaks to Josiah Bancroft's skill as an author.
It definitely does. And he's also got very captivating prose that can keep you invested. I think that it's amazing how much an author can get away with when they're like, in terms of a story potentially seeming slow or what have you. Like you can talk about Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle that some folks would call slow, or say they don't like how the second book, they feel like meanders for over 1,000 pages and doesn't accomplish what they were hoping for. But it's one of my favorite
kind
series.
Of you to lampoon Wheel of Time and Wise Man's Fear, Kingkiller Chronicles too. So
I love. Oh, I'm not lampooning it. I just have noticed that as criticism that people say. I love it. I mean, that's Kingkiller Chronicle. That and First Law are pretty much my favorite series, and it's like anyway. Prose trying to talk about Rothfuss gets away with pretty much doing whatever he wants. In the realm of fantasy writing. He gets a lot of criticism online for other things that he does in the real world, but he gets away with his fantasy writing choices because of his incredible prose. And that's something that even there are times where I could see this book as being perceived as slow, but it never feels like that. And a big part of that is Josiah Bancroft is the kind of guy who can drop a line that you're like, oh wait, let me just stop for a second and let me think about that sentence and what he's trying to say, and then you can move forward. And I find that's rarer than you might think in the fantasy genre. Like even someone like Brandon Sanderson talks about how like he wants his prose to be a clear window through which people can see the story, and he'll say like, I don't even really want people to stop and think about the beautiful line I just crafted, because then they're not in the story at that moment. So I mean, there's different ways of writing it. He talks about how like other writers do it differently, and that's incredible as well, but that's not what he's trying to accomplish. Bancroft actually has a background as a poet, and you'll see that come up in how poetic, for lack of a better way of putting it. You can see I'm not a poet. How poetic his prose is.
Interesting. I mean, it's got all the ingredients for something pretty special. You know what it also kind of reminds me of from the story and the setting and all that? Have you seen Spirited Away?
I have.
Is it kind of like that, where it's like you've got this little girl who gets separated from her parents, or her parents get turned into pigs or whatever, and she gets this very foreign fish out of water scenario where the rules change every 2 minutes, almost like an odyssey of characters and stuff that happens to her until she, you know, grows up and all that good stuff. Is it anything like that? And you got also this like kind of, you're not quite sure what's happening. Everything's always changing. It's kind of surreal at times. That also is the connection.
That's a good comparison for sure. I would say that Spirited Away feels a lot more whimsical. Like this is this. It just feels like there's a lot feeling of being in like the dark underbelly of the world. No matter what ringdom he's in, it's like everything still feels kind of corrupt. And like I said before, you don't want to trust anyone. It's a story where you're always on edge. Every time he's meeting a new character, you're like, oh, what's this character gonna do? Like, I don't trust him. And I think that in Spirited Away, while it has that same kind of feel of just like a normal human taken into this world where it's like, what is going on? And having to learn some lessons and all that kind of stuff.
Grittier.
I think it's a good comparison, but yeah, this is, like you just said, grittier and darker.
Looking at the cover also, it's like very industrial, but the guy's wearing like a suit, and then it's this stark red on black. Is there any kind of parallel to history of like the USSR or like anything like that? Or is that just the cover art throwing me for a loop? Because I'm getting like Soviet Russia vibes from the cover.
If there's anything to do with the USSR, then it went so far over my head it might have flown over the Tower of Babel. But it's but I see what you're getting at, Charles.
The story doesn't sound like it is, but I'm looking at the cover and I'm like, this looks like USSR propaganda poster,
there is kind of, I'm trying to think if I can get into this even really without spoiling anything, but there is a sense of like, this is what the nature of the tower and the ways in which it's maybe not as great as it seemed to be when he was planning out his honeymoon there. Like, this is how those negative aspects of the tower can impact people and make them not the best in how they treat other people. I don't know how to say that without spoiling stuff, but it's kind of got this, like, this is what these aspects of society can do to people when they're pushed to this point. And it's like there's some sort of meditation and musings on like, I guess, just like the nature of humanity that go on here. I think there's a lot more to explore in the future books around that, but you get the sense of, because like Senlin comes in and he's very naive, he's from a small town and he's optimistic, he believes in the good of people, and like he's never had to deal with these situations where people are I guess more like scrounging for their resources and their livelihood and more corruption, that kind of stuff. He's just not acquainted with that, so he comes in with this very positive view of humanity, and it's like, how is that altered or not altered in the face of some information that contradicts that, like, everyone's so grand. But yeah, I think that's about as far as I can go there. But I'll say the cover is, it probably gives us sort of that industriousness that it's giving off, Charles. Part of that is the book is steampunk. I mean, in terms of the technology.
I haven't read a lot of steampunk. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's interesting that we're like 35 minutes into the episode, and this is the first time I've said steampunk. And it's like, because to me, I don't know, people talk about for sure in their reviews, but I guess I'm like, that's pretty secondary, if not tertiary, to like the whole thing. It's like, it is steampunk. That is a level of technology, and there are like airships and things like that. But I guess it's like the tower itself is like each level is so unique and different. You almost feel like you've entered into a whole new world where it's like does the technology change drastically? No, but I'm not. You almost stop feeling like you're necessarily in the same like subgenre of fantasy novel when you're like, okay, now we're here, and it's like this, which is all I can really do from a spoiler-free angle. We're here, it's like this, and you're kind of just in a totally new mindset. And there's this background sense of like, oh, there's airships, and people who maybe aren't like Senlin think to pay to airship to a particular area, and then airship back down, and they don't have to go through all of the ringdoms he has to go through to get to where he initially intended. But it's like, I don't know, steampunk. It wouldn't be like if someone was like, I'm a huge fan of steampunk. I wouldn't be like, oh, you like steampunk? Have I got the novel for you? It's like, I don't know. It's not like a huge aspect of it.
Interesting.
In my eyes. I mean, there's ways I think you can make the case it's a huge aspect, but those are not at the forefront in this novel. That's about all I can say, I guess.
Yeah, because I don't know. It's like the steampunk genre is kind of a very specific vibe, you know? So it's kind of interesting that this book dabbles in it, but it's not like the forefront of its setting and its like
I think future books
aesthetic
will be more steampunk, I guess, is something I can try to say.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, I guess that is a good question. This is one book of 4. Is this like a standalone with sequel potential, or are we getting into like cliffhanger, gotta read the next one? Like, how are we at with the ending?
Yeah, I would say it's closer to cliffhanger, gotta read the next one. And that is, for me, the part of it that was least satisfying, because, you know, I'm all about, I think you are too, Charles, I'm all about the, like, write your first book as standalone with sequel potential. Even if you fully plan on writing.
I just am a fan of contained stories,
yes.
You know, where it's like, contain your story in the book. It can have sequels and it can be 12 books long, but
sure,
give me at least a reading experience, you know. Don't give me half of a reading experience and then have to go to another book, you know. I feel that.
Yeah.
So you're saying that happens a little bit in this book? It doesn't sound like it's too bad.
I would say that if you it's tough to talk about endings without spoilers, but I'll just say that you will probably feel like the story was not fully told if you stop at the end of the first book. I mean, that's where I am. I'm at the end of the first book, and I would say they're like this particular story that began with the beginning of book 1, like, is far from over. And I think that, yeah, there's a lot more to... It's not just like... Yeah, I can't say much more than that. But it does not give the sense of a book that would ever make sense as a standalone book. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Well, it's like, let's say... I think it's not spoilery to say, like, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I feel fully comfortable that if someone just wanted to read the first book of Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, it's like, all right, you've read that full story. Clearly there's a lot more to do. I mean, we're talking about a series that has an initial trilogy, a trilogy that takes place like in a different era, like era 2 of Mistborn trilogy,
universe.
Then a whole Cosmere universe around it, and supposedly there's going to be a third era of the Mistborn series. So it's like, there's a lot to do. Like you said, Charles, we're at 12 books. Who cares? But I think you'd agree with me. Mistborn, the first book, tells Mistborn, The Final Empire, the confusingly titled The Final Empire, book 1 of Mistborn. Like, that tells a full, complete story, and if that's where you want to stop, sure, Should you stop? No.
It's a
The
great
next books are
ending,
amazing. But, oh, so good. But,
It's a really
dude,
good
the
ending.
ending to the whole trilogy is even better, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this isn't a
I mean, it's just a
misborn...
masterpiece.
Yeah. This isn't a misborn episode, but just to, give a sense of... You've got a book that's known for, like, its foreshadowing and how it sets up the final conclusion of the trilogy, but you still can tell it contains story in the first one. I would say Senlin Ascends definitely leads you like, okay, well, I guess if I want this full story, I've got to read at least the next
That's
book.
good to know. That's good to know because I wasn't sure. You never know with these, kinds of series where you're going to be left off. And to me, I would feel obligated if I was going to pick up one. I'd pick up all of them. And that's just another level of commitment to just be ready for. And that kind of matters to me when I'm picking a book. I'm like, how much of a commitment am I signing up for here? Can I read one and move on? Or do I got to read 4 books? Like, what are we talking about here? So that's good to know. Not a deterrent by any means, but it's good to know. Because even like, say Joe Abercrombie, The Blade itself, that ending... Is it a contained story?
That's when you gotta read the whole trilogy.
Yeah, you gotta read the whole thing, and it's our favorite series of all time. So it's there's no one way to do it. It's good to know, though. It's good to know. But sounds like we're nearing the end here. I just got my classic age old questions of who would you recommend this book to, and what other books are like it that you would recommend for fans of this book, or maybe fans of other books that if they have read those, they would want to give this a read.
Dude, this one is so hard. And I know,
it sounds very unique.
Always know that question is
Catherine Voyage.
And I'm like, Catherine Voyage is an amazing call there, Charles. That would be like among the highest of books that I would recommend for... I would recommend fans of the Catherine Voyage, check this one out. You know what, actually? So you mentioned that Mark Lawrence wrote a review. It sounds like quite a few years ago, though, at this point, right? When was that review from? 2016, you said?
Right.
Something like that. And he said, this is nothing like any of my books, or not like my work. And it's like, you know what this actually is a little bit more like? Is The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence.
Interesting.
I would say, because I would say that The Book That Wouldn't Burn...
He does get a little weird with it in The Book That Wouldn't Burn.
Exactly. I would say it's because he does get a little bit more surreal, a little bit more weird with those books, a little bit more and a little bit more jumping into very different worlds I don't know how else I can put it, not spoiling anything there, but it's like, I think that sort of jarring, but in a good way, sensation of like, okay, we're here, now we're there, oh, now everything's different, oh, what are the rules of this place? I think that definitely is present in The Book That Wouldn't Burn. And you know what? So that would be one of my recommendations. I liked Spirited Away there, Charles. I'll also say, so on the I always look like the Goodreads readers also enjoyed. It's got all 3 books of Fondelee's Greenbone saga. That's the Jade City, Jade Legacy. Then there's a Sanderson book, Tress of the Emerald Sea, which we haven't read yet.
That's one of his new ones. One of his COVID drops.
Secret projects.
I wrote 4 books.
Yeah.
I think that was one of them, right?
It's hard for everyone, and it was hard for me, so I wrote 4 books. He definitely did that. And then, it's all 3 books of those are what comes up first. And I'm not sure, Charles. I don't really see that. But I don't really see the similarities, really. I wonder why that's the case. But I guess, according to Goodreads, if you're a fan of the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, then this might be a good fit for you.
Sounded like Goodreads was struggling a little bit, just as you are.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a series that the number one thing that everyone's always saying about it is that it's unique and they don't know what to compare it to. And then it's like, all right, now I got to compare it to stuff and say fans of blah 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 will love Senlin Ascends. It's like, I don't know, Charles, and maybe the fact that I am struggling here is the best recommendation I can give. Because it's like, it's unique, it's captivating, there's so much to love here, and I think that a lot of people would really enjoy this one.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's piqued my interest. I'm just so captivated by the idea of, like, he's got a great voice, a great setting, creative plot, like, endorsed by, people who I respect and admire in the industry and all this, and praise from you as well. So there's a lot.
I got one, Charles.
Oh, let's hear it.
Robin Hobb, the Farseer trilogy. Not
really?
Because it's not anything. Okay, so it's not anything like the series. Very different. Like Robin Hobb feels very classic, like medieval European fantasy sort of stuff. Nothing to do with Senlin Ascends' Tower of Babel steampunk stuff. But we're talking about a relatively, they say, mild-mannered character, more of an everyman, and it is one point of view and basically a character study of this person, how they react to really intense circumstances surrounding them, and an environment that forces them into certain roles that they would never take of their own volition. And I think if you get to that fundamental psychological experience, then it's actually pretty similar to what you're reading in terms of Fitz chivalry in the Farseer trilogy. So fans of Robin Hobb.
It's also one of those, like, more challenging to appreciate kind of things too, where it's like, is it slow or is it just different?
Beautiful.
Is it beautiful? Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, well, we're lots of interesting polls to talk about Senlin Ascends, and it's such an interesting story of how it came about too, and just all around a really interesting work that I hope to add to my reading repertoire one day. But for now, I'm glad that you got to read it. You kind of screened it for me, gave me that endorsement. Thank you, because sometimes books like that can be considered risky for me. So I just had a feeling it was going to be good, though.
Yes, this is why Senlin is so much like you, Charles. The idea of picking up a book that sounds different from other books that you've read is very risky. I don't know if I'm ready to take that on.
I was leaning. So it was favorable odds,
Imagine this man that you're hearing talk, the one that is scared to try a book that's outside of his comfort zone, but might be willing to, despite the risk. Imagine him thrust into the world of the Tower of Babel.
I did choose A Court of Thorns and Roses, like tens of millions. How many millions of Goodreads reviews? I don't know if it's 10 million, but it's a lot of Goodreads reviews.
I think
2 million Goodreads reviews, and was a pretty safe pick, and I'm glad we read it. But I did feel like I missed out on this more. It feels more like a gem, than some of the others.
Hidden gem.
The fans,
although not as hidden anymore.
Not as hidden anymore, but it was hidden it lay dormant for years. It was one of those things that was like, this book was written and shelved for 3 years before it got published. Which is kind of crazy to think about.
It's so weird. Yeah.
So crazy to think about, but that's just the kind of world that we live in where these things are possible. So shout out to Mark Lawrence, shout out to Josiah Bancroft, and Dylan, unless there's anything more you have to say about this book, I think we can get that sweet, sweet outro music going.
Last thing is that our friends over at Fantology interviewed Josiah Bancroft, so
I gotta check that out.
Yeah, wanted to give you folks a heads up to head over there if you want to learn more about the book. They keep it spoiler free over there too, and yeah, you can get to know the author. Seems like a really interesting dude, and of course they conduct a great interview over there.
Good shout out. We definitely got to check that out.
Yeah.
So I know what I'm doing tonight.
Someone has big plans.
That's right. So let's go ahead and wrap this up then, so we can get on to that. What do you say?
I say let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right, here we go. Thank you all, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. If you like what you heard today, a great way to let us know is over on the socials. That's at the FTF podcast on Instagram and at the FTF podcast with a number 1 at the end for Twitter, aka X. And now, Dylan, if the audience like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than engaging with us over on the socials, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify. It's just 2 clicks at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and helps us so much when you do that. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. That means you can write nice things about us on there, and you know what? When you do that, it puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you all so much for listening. Puts a big smile on my face as well. You guys are awesome. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.